Gender equity and state policy for gender mainstreaming and inclusive approach. Ever since 1974, when the study on status of women in India was undertaken and the report called Towards Equality was published, innumerable conferences, suggestions and efforts by the national and international agencies, policies and measures by the Indian government and lobbying and advocacy by the NGOs have been undertaken to make gender emerge at the center of social and political consciousness in India. While policies were formulated, actions were taken and institutions were set up, the responsibility for improving the status of women was viewed and attempted as the responsibility of only those government departments and those agencies which dealt with women. Women study centers, women oriented NGOs, women's movements and other agencies alone were expected to focus on women as target groups and as work for their development and empowerment. Logically, but wrongly, it came to be understood that what is mentioned was for women and all the rest belonged to men. This diluted the efforts of the national organizations and the government and marginalized the whole issue and led to a lack of wider attention. It reduced the budgetary provisions, support and commitment and resulted in poor implementation and monitoring by the authorities. It is even felt that if the goals of advancement are gradually being reached, women always remain less than equal. Social concern is diluted and everyday affairs still smack of patriarchal dominance. There still remains a gap in achieving gender equality, equal rights for men and women and equal status in the society. There still remains the need for integration of gender relations and women's issues in all the activities. This has led to a widespread and continuous debate on the approach to women's issues and the strategies and methodology which should be adopted in dealing with the women's question. So, the question arises, should there be a special focus on women's issues and a set of special agencies, or should there be an integrated approach wherein the women's issues, even while receiving the special attention and focus, will be a part of the whole? Instead of the achievements of women's development be the concern of only women related or women only agencies, should it not become the responsibility of all of us? Should it not require that women's question emerge at the center and inform all the policies and measures, activities of all the institutions, public or private, and come to be internalized by one and all? It is in this light that a new concept, an inclusive approach and a strategy called gender mainstreaming emerged in the UN Millennium Goals document with the objectives of equal opportunities for men and women. The women's development and their approaches varies. This approach to women's studies in India has gone through the same pattern as women's place in the planning process. Starting with a total subsuming of women concerns in the social sciences, wherein the women had been taken for granted and had not been focused, the academics have gone through a period of special focus on women with a view to point out to gender inequality, inequity and discrimination and subordination in the social and political development of women. In the 1960s and 70s, in the 5th and the 6th plans, 5-year plans in India, there was a special mention of women's development. Gender and women's development became a part of the integrated development of women in development approach in the 1970s and 80s. After the first international conference decade on women in Mexico in 1975 and the publication of the report of the Commission on the Status of Women in India in 1976, attempts were being made to both by the NGOs and by the government to improve the status of various developmental measures. The government appointed the National Committee on Women in 1976 with the Prime Minister Srimati Indira Gandhi as its president. The various 5-year plans for India's development gave a special focus for women and devoted sections for them. In all these plans and policies and measures, the approach was mainly one of women's development with emphasis on their improvement in education, health and income generation. The fourth 5-year plan particularly talked about creation of employment, income generation through self-employment, quota in government schemes like IRDP and greater participation of development programs and benefits. Thus, the approach was one of development from above and the state as the benefactor and the women as the receivers. But over the next few decades, the condition of women gradually and marginally improved. Not merely the urban, but even the rural women began to partake in their own and national development. But there remained many questions whether this led to a gradual improvement in the status of women in society. Were any attempts made to organize the women beneficiaries to access and receive the developmental benefits even up to the targeted quota? If the target figures were not reached, as they were not in various fields, even after 5-year plans, what were the main reasons? One of the reasons identified rather correctly was the lack of access of women to the various developmental process due to the prevalence of the patriarchal forces and institutions and the poor collective strength. Schemes like Dwakra, that is a group project, Mahila Kosh, it is a government loans to overcome lack of financial capital to women, etc., were devised in order to overcome at least partially the societal obstacles. The women, especially in the rural areas, were expected to form their own groups, discuss and devise their own enterprises and become partners in their own enterprises. The collectivity and the organization among the women, it was further expected, would help them to stand on their own feet and face the patriarchal onslaughts, both economically and socially. However, the very same patriarchal and conservative forces in the form of bureaucratic formalities, red tapeism, family interventions led to the scheme's miserable collapse. The succeeding governments went back to wage employment, quota, affirmative action, schemes like MGNREGS as it is called, as well as measures for women's development. The failure of these varied attempts and their approaches made many rethink about women's question. It was realized that development has been attempted only as an economic and monetary development, not an overall and holistic advancement. That it had not been viewed as a part of the participatory process of devising the policies for women by women, that the women had not been viewed as partners in governance and policy making, but only as mute beneficiaries. Hence, the concept of women in development and governance came up. It meant a relook at the constitution, the functioning of the Indian democracy for the past half a century, and the meager and minimum participation of women in the democratic processes and practices. The constitutional, legal and democratic powers and the rights of women as citizens and rulers were realized. It was recognized that even while women had been confirmed with all the rights and powers and values like equality and liberty had been guaranteed by the constitution, and even when women were powerful, quote and unquote, legally, they were found to be weak, vulnerable, deprived and subordinated in practice. Burdened with familiar and childbearing rearing duties and chores of following marriage, women ceased to recognize their own capabilities, contribution and equal citizenship rights and roles in democracy. Dominated by patriarchal system through the historical period, the women lost their political power, the power to navigate, participate, relate, get involved, negotiate, discuss, direct, decide, implement and monitor. These are the various political roles were not observed. It was recognized that what the women had and have by way of social, political and economic powers need to be revived, they need to be reinforced and exercised. The historical pressures and obstacles and disabilities which were incapacitating the women to enjoy and exercise this power have to be neutralized, and the access to and benefits of development should be made more easy. Special measures, if need be, should be introduced to make these realizable. Looking from the angle of women's status, it is then that the whole notion of a new concept called empowerment came up. It referred to the package of additional instruments that may not create new rights, but recognize their own existing rights, capabilities, contribution and equal citizenship rights and roles. It will help in accessing and utilizing the already existing rights and power, the natural rights, human rights, constitutional rights or any other rights, creation of a new entitlements through social legislations, legal rights such as laws against domestic violence, dowry, sexual harassment. It will re-look into the personal laws and their implementation through administrative policies and measures. The constitutional 73rd and 74th amendment on local self-government, with 33% mandatory reservation for women to make the reservation participation real in the field of political rights. The right to education to reinforce the directive principles of state policy, which talk about free and compulsory education for children below 50 years. The right to information to enable the citizens participate meaningfully in the democratic republic as mentioned in the preamble, are among the many amendments and legislations that reinforce and capacitated the ordinary citizens of this country to access what is really already understood as the given. The empowerment, however, is not just an additional tool to gain access to development. It is more a political power, an acquisition of the capacity to question, judge and change. Thus, by whatever route we reach empowerment, whether it is by education or employment or citizenship roles, is ultimately political capacity and power. Thus, to sum up, what are the different strategies which we have adopted for development? We can question ourselves. The Women and Development Strategy, one, that is WID and GID. The different strategies that the various governments and states adopted for women's development could be thus summarized as women focused self-employment approach like the chapters in IRDP, group and collective approach like in Dwakra scheme, economic support and self-employment and development like Mahila Kosh, special loans and quotas and loans in reservation schemes as beneficiaries. These are many of the developmental schemes we had, but we also need mainstreaming strategies. The women component plan, the allocation of resources in the various programs and the various schemes and budgetary provisions for women is one of the mainstreaming strategy. In short, gender budgeting and monitoring is a part of this empowerment. Empowerment and leadership roles is another one which is a mainstreaming strategy. Participation in decision making at all levels following the platform for action of the Beijing Conference in Governance is another one. Participation in governance, 73rd, 74th amendments, in the committees, in the negotiating bodies, in the commissions, in the governing bodies of institutions and the boards of agencies, including the public sector undertakings and the private companies, etc. These are all some of the empowering strategies. The question still to be asked, have these strategies really empowered the women? For instance, one example, the political empowerment of women. Taking it as, has the participation of 33% of women in the local elections really truly empowered them? Any number of studies have pointed out to much political awakening, consciousness, exercise of political rights thanks to these amendments. Many have also pointed out to the gradual wearing away of traditional attitudes and stereotyped prejudices against the elected panchayat women. irrespective of their caste and class. They got recognized, invited, and honored on occasions. Some of them have emerged as very able, vocal, and courageous, capable of bold initiatives. But they are, by and large, limited to the mandatory provisions of law. Despite by now 25 years of this experiment or more, the basic status of women in the broader society or politics of rural India does not seem to have appreciably changed. The politically successful women are not recognized or encouraged, nor are they picked up for higher positions, and the political careers of many of the aspiring women are cut short. This leads to much frustration and disempowerment. The domination of males and families, of domestic factors, of the norms of caste, tribes and class, and of religion and tradition have not diluted much. If anything, the patriarchal backlash in the form of increasing violence and crimes against women like sexual harassment, stalking, rape, molestation, and incidents like honor killing have become manifold. The role of Kap panchayats, caste panchayats, dowry issues have enlarged and strengthened thanks to the democratic processes in India causing havoc in women's rights. The constitutional panchayats, with their limited powers and jurisdiction, are proving powerless against them. Thus, mere political empowerment to access political rights by itself may not have sustained political power with which to overcome all other challenges. Other measures like economic resources like property right, work and income generation, education, radical social reforms, sensitization, awareness raising, etc., have to accompany the political measures. Equally important is the need to integrate the efforts to effectively fulfill the other empowering measures like RTE, right to education, RTI, right to information, the SC and ST reservations, and other affirmative action agenda. Thus, the empowerment or even development efforts cannot be compartmentalized. They need to act and interact with one another. Empowerment cannot be divided as economic, political or social, as very often we seem to be doing it. The other important consequence of the segregation of women's issues has been that it has failed to teach the society as a whole to view the women's issues as social issues, and everybody is concerned. The Aam Aadmi remains an Aadmi, man, and does not include Aam Aurat, namely the woman. One rarely comes across a demonstration or a lobbying or an advocacy action like that of over Nirbhaya in the streets with an appreciable number of men and women of all ages and walks of life participating in it. One rarely sees the male MPs taking interest over the reservation bill in the parliament, women's reservation bill in the parliament. Even the success of panchayat women in their governance roles does not seem to interest more than a few NGOs or male social activists or academics. It has become a situation of women for women and the rest for men. Wherever there has been reservation as in official policies or in the local governments, 33% is for women, the rest 67% becomes general or in other words for men. Where there is no woman specific criterion, reservation or quota, women, even if they are well qualified and deserving, they are overlooked. Where the women only steps are activated, women seem to get marginalized. Even in the academic and policy oriented activities like workshops concerning women, the males are rarely present. Women's studies courses with the gender focused syllabi do not attract many students, rarely any really interested male students. The authorities too also show indifference, not much enthusiasm. This shows that despite years of lobbying and advocacy or even formulation of policies and acts, unconstitutional provisions and amendments, the impact has been non-existent or only marginal. Women continue to be marginalized. Hence, the many national and international agencies and activities have begun to talk of what you call mainstreaming gender segregated actions. Gender balance rather than gender focus is the cry. Mainstreaming is thus not just bringing about equality in numbers, it is just not the progression in figures or the visibility of a few select women at the top. A few prime ministers and presidents, a countable few chief ministers and ministers, a few MPs, MLAs, vice chancellors, registrars, etc., do not complete the picture. They are accountable few illustrious women managers, heads of departments and institutions whose names can be celebrated. It shows thereby that the number is not so many for us to take the trend for granted or as a normal practice. The more important point is the impact on other women and men of their roles and whether this has emerged as a normal trend. A macro study and a broader analysis should be aiming at the long term goals and visions for women, which is not possible unless women and their issues are integrated with a wider picture of the society, politics and economy of the country. The solution should also be searched in the wider whole and not in isolation. The efforts for the same should be also sought in the wider policy frameworks and not in exclusive policies for women, which after a while become nothing but mere tokenism, political promises and a cliche. The struggle to achieve the same has to be waged by both women and men, women and the authorities, and not merely by the women NGOs and women study centers. Indeed, to sum up, the dilemma of integrated versus segregated is one dilemma. Marginalized versus general is another dilemma which faces squarely in the governance of the nation. One has to be specialized and focused in order that one can integrate meaningfully. This is true of every field, with the authority of the knowledge and awareness of ground reality and the strength of inevitability and the necessity. In the midst of all these concerns, there is also a new concern which has come up, that is, India is awakening to the needs of the third gender and the LGBTQ, as we call them, whom the Supreme Court in its recent judgments has highlighted. The state and society in India should take their special issues and needs into attention, make special provisions and support. In the light of the Supreme Court judgment, their issues and focus may be different, but the essence of patriarchy, its negative forces and their features is in a conservative patriarchal society or state apply to them equally or the same way. This is where we have to keep asking some questions. Over the years, 70 years or more, whether this has led to a gradual improvement in the status of women in society. And number two, what are the different strategies adopted for women's development in India as well as elsewhere? 3, have these strategies really empowered the women? And lastly, in view of the emerging situation and the issues and the judiciary's opinions, your suggestions for policies with special focus on LGBTQ. Thank you.